If you're raising a child with autism, you've probably experienced the confusion that comes with trying to make sense of it all. One expert says one thing, another says the opposite, and social media is full of opinions. Every week there's a new therapy, a new program, a new approach claiming to be the answer. And somewhere in the middle of all this noise, you're trying to figure out what's actually best for your child. That's why I recommend Lynn R. Curry and Elevate How You Navigate. Lynn is the father of an autistic son, host of the Autism Parenting Secrets podcast, and someone who understands firsthand how overwhelming the autism journey can be. His focus isn't on adding more noise. It's on helping parents gain clarity, confidence, and a practical path forward. Through his coaching and guidance, Lynn helps parents cut through the noise, sort through conflicting advice, and make decisions with greater confidence. The goal isn't to tell you what to think. It's to help you navigate your family's unique situation with greater certainty and purpose. Lynn offers a free strategic clarity call where you can discuss your family's challenges, explore opportunities for growth, and identify meaningful next steps. To learn more or schedule your free call, visit elevatehowyouNavigate.com. Because when parents have clarity, they can navigate with confidence, and that can make all the difference in the world. First, I would like to mention MAYU water. If you're trying to upgrade your hydration, MAYU uses a vortex flow system that mimics how water naturally moves in rivers and streams. That motion helps increase oxygenation and release unwanted gases like chlorine, improving overall water quality and making it easier to stay consistently hydrated. But here's what most people overlook. Hydration isn't just about water. It's about minerals and absorption. MAYU allows you to remineralize your water with essential minerals and electrolytes, supporting cellular hydration, energy levels, and overall physiological balance. When your water has the right structure and mineral content, your body can actually use it more efficiently. If you care about hydration, performance, or just feeling better day to day, this is one of those simple upgrades that adds up. You can get 10% off with the code AUTISM. Next, Daylight Computer Company and Daylight Kids. These devices are designed to work with your brain, not against it. And honestly, the future of tech is already here. Most screens are built for stimulation, bright, fast, and attention-grabbing. But that often leads to eye strain, mental fatigue, and disrupted sleep. Daylight takes a different approach. By reducing blue light and lowering your overall sensory load, these devices support sustained focus, calmer attention, and healthier sleep patterns. For anyone who feels drained after screen time, or for kids whose nervous systems are still developing, this creates a much more natural, regulated way to engage with technology. If you want your tech to support your brain instead of overstimulating it, this is worth checking out. Use code AUTISM for $50 off. And finally, Chroma light devices, lights designed for humans. Natural light contains a full spectrum that our brains and bodies are tuned to. But most modern indoor lighting falls short of that. It's often narrow, harsh, and out of sync with how we're designed to experience light. Chroma is built to bring that balance back. These lights are designed to better reflect the qualities of natural light, supporting your circadian rhythm, reducing sensory strain, and creating environments that feel calmer and more aligned. That can translate into better sleep, more stable energy, and a nervous system that isn't constantly being pushed toward overload. If you have ever felt off under certain lighting and didn't know why, This is worth exploring. Get 10% off with the code AUTISM. If you're optimizing your environment, your focus, your well-being, your nervous system, these products are worth checking out. For today's episode of the Autism and Structure of Reality series, Part 7, we are going to cover the Beatitudes, reordering of the self. Your reception determines transformation, transcendence, one could say. The seed is the word. The soil, however, is your internal state. In the last episode, we explored the 3 temptations: need, image, and control. And perhaps the deeper realization was this: the temptations were not random moral tests. They were distorted structures for organizing reality. They progressively trained attention, reward, identity, emotional response, and behavior, or one could say action. They trained the internal calculators of the self. And maybe that is why the temptations still feel modern. Because modern systems increasingly organize themselves around the same distortions: comfort, visibility, and control. So now the question becomes, if the self can be distorted, can it also be transformed? Humans have an infinite capacity to think and believe and change, create. Our thoughts are human creations. Remember from the previous episodes, you don't owe your thoughts anything. You are not obligated to entertain those thoughts. And perhaps this is where the Beatitudes become psychologically profound. Because the Beatitudes are not merely religious sayings, passive virtues, or moral slogans. They are progressive transformations of the self. Or perhaps even deeper, there are progressive recalibrations, evaluation itself. And maybe this is why the structure matters so much. The first Beatitude and the last Beatitude are both present tense. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. You get it now. Not will be, is. And perhaps that is not accidental, because the Beatitudes begin with openness, your reception to change. And the end is congruence. The kingdom is already present, first through openness, and finally through alignment. And maybe the entire progression begins with one difficult realization. Most people do not simply lack self-awareness. Self-awareness, however, is difficult. You will spend an infinite amount of time explaining to yourself why you are the way you are. They live inside explanatory structures that protect them from seeing themselves clearly. Human beings constantly construct explanations for who they are, why they act, what they value, and why they suffer. The whole series of this Autism and Structure of Reality is understanding who determines your values. Where do you find your values and pleasures? And determining the self. And many of those explanations become external. Society, parents, systems, labels, other people, culture, circumstances. Now, importantly, many of those things are real, but psychologically, explanation can also become defense. The mind constantly attempts to stabilize itself. So it constructs narratives that reduce, uncertainty, guilt, vulnerability, ambiguity, and internal tension. Humans will spend as much time needed to spin up these alternative explanations of why they are the way they are. Remember, the brain, the central nervous system, more specifically, does not like to work. It just wants to respond. And we just act. It just acts, constantly acting to return to comfort. Who determines that comfort? Who determines that alignment with comfort and values inside yourself? And perhaps this is one reason true self-awareness is so difficult. Because seeing yourself clearly threatens the ego, the persona, emotional defenses, and identity itself. And maybe this is why transformation begins with humility. Not weakness, not self-hatred, but openness. The willingness to say, maybe I do not fully understand myself. And perhaps that is the gate. And perhaps the kingdom is not merely a place. Perhaps it is transformed mode of being, a structure of self no longer organized primarily around fear, fragmentation, performance, domination, or defensive identity. And psychologically, stability is often prioritized before truth. This is why works as Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky and Carl Jung has been so prominent in this series. And now, from the last episode and today's episode, we are going to provide the most dominant source of structure in finding yourself. Which means many explanations do not emerge because they are fully accurate. They emerge because they reduce internal tension enough for the self to remain psychologically stable. The first beatitude: blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This may be one of the most misunderstood lines in the entire Sermon on the Mount. And it is the first line and the longest account of Jesus in one continuous teaching. So not only is this line the first line of the Beatitudes, it is the very first line of the entire Sermon on the Mount. Poor in spirit does not mean worthless, pathetic, weak, or psychologically broken. It means humility and openness, receptive, awareness of incompleteness. Or perhaps more simply, I can't. Not I'm worthless, but I am not complete. And psychologically, that is massive difference. Because transformation rarely begins with certainty. It begins with openness and vulnerability and the collapse of ego inflation. Carl Jung. Throughout modern life, people often encouraged to project confidence and optimize themselves, construct identity, and perform certainty. Fit in. Can you fit in or not? Are you like the so-called normal people or not? But psychologically, defended systems do not transform easily. They're not true. They're not real. This is where Carl Rogers becomes incredibly important. One of my favorite psychologists. Rogers said, the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. That insight fits this beatitude perfectly. Because many people attempt self-improvement while remaining defended, performative, ashamed, fragmented, or discounted from themselves, or disconnected from themselves. But genuine transformation requires honesty and openness and self-awareness first. We will outline change in a two-step process: self-awareness and then self-acceptance. Humility becomes the gate to self-acceptance. And maybe this is why the first beatitude is present tense. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Because openness itself already changes the structure of the self. The ego stops defending long enough for updating to begin. And computationally, this fits perfectly with predictive processing. The brain continuously builds models of reality, of the world, and of the self. What are you going to do in this moment? Or what are you going to do if this moment happens? And then lastly, what do you actually do in that moment? But defended models resist updating because defended identities protect continuation more than truth. And the more rigid the self becomes, the harder it becomes for reality to update it. Humility reduces defensive certainty. And perhaps transformation begins precisely there. Humility is not weakness. It is the willingness to stop defending incompleteness. Society talks about confidence, and they only have it partially defined. Society is good at saying a can-do attitude. I can do it. You can do it. You got this. That is only a small portion of confidence. Confidence is being willing to say, I can't. I need some help. I need to reevaluate this situation. Can you say that again? Can you help me? I am not sure I understand. Confidence is when your perception of the self matches the reality of the situation. And don't miss that. The second beatitude: blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Again, mourning is often interpreted too narrowly. Not merely sadness, not grief, but emotional depth. The willingness to allow reality into consciousness fully. This is great for Carl Jung. Or perhaps the courage to stop emotionally avoiding yourself. Modern systems often encourage emotional suppression through distraction, stimulation, performance, productivity, and endless noise. But mourning interrupts avoidance. It allows suffering, limitation, regret, grief, vulnerability, and shadow material to become conscious. This is deeply Jungian because Jung believed transformation required confrontation with the unconscious, not escaping it, not suppressing it, seeing it. And perhaps this is why genuine mourning feels so psychologically disruptive. The self is no longer merely managing pain. It is allowing previously defended reality into consciousness fully. And perhaps mourning is precisely that process. Emotional honesty, emotional exposure, and emotional integration. The self stops constructing explanations around pain and finally allows pain to be seen directly. And psychologically, this matters enormously because suppressed emotional material does not disappear. It continues shaping behavior and identity, relationships, and perception unconsciously. The self cannot fully transform while hiding from itself emotionally. And perhaps this is why mourning is connected to comfort.
not because pain disappears immediately, but because emotional fragmentation begins decreasing. What is hidden begins integrating. What is unconscious begins becoming conscious. And maybe that is one of the deepest forms of comfort possible. Transformation requires more than insight. It requires emotional honesty and depth. The third beatitude, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, notably, this is probably my favorite. This may be the most misunderstood beatitude. Modern culture often hears meekness as weakness, passivity, lack of ambition, or submissiveness. This is also not about avoiding or having a lack of opportunity to face hard things in life. Does not equal morality. But psychologically, meekness is something much deeper. Meekness is strength under control, or perhaps power that no longer needs constant expression. This is not weakness. This is regulated strength. And maybe this is the first major sign that transformation is becoming embodied. Because the reactive self begins weakening. Impulsivity weakens. Defensive aggression weakens. Compulsive dominance weakens. And courage begins emerging instead. Not performative courage, and not ego, not aggression, but the courage to expose yourself honestly, to engage reality directly, to move into uncertainty without collapsing, and to tolerate discomfort without immediate escape. The brain, spine, the central nervous system does not want to work. It only wants to respond, and you will bail out. You will react to return to comfort, to ease, to certainty. This directly counters the first temptation, because now discomfort is no longer automatically interpreted as threat. The self becomes less reactive and more stable, more disciplined. This is the completion of confidence. The nervous system becomes less organized around immediate threat reduction. Immediate relief loses dominance over long-term meaning. And computationally, the value hierarchy itself begins changing. Meaning begins outweighing impulse. Long-term alignment begins outweighing immediate relief. And this is not passive. It is highly trained regulation. And perhaps this is why the first temptation becomes weaker as transformation progresses. Because the self is no longer ruled automatically by discomfort. Meekness is not the absence of strength. It is strength that no longer needs to prove itself constantly. The fourth beatitude, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Now the motivational structure itself changes. Courage is gained from meek, and a new path begins. This is extremely important because transformation is not merely behavioral restraint or emotional awareness or moral performance. It is reorganization of desire itself. And perhaps this is where internal calculators framework becomes incredibly useful. If you haven't seen the episodes on the internal calculators, please view those. There's a lot to be known about how you're constructed from a neurobiology aspect. The brain continuously calculates reward and cost, value, effort, and meaning. Remember, value is the net difference, the delta of reward minus cost, meaning biological energy used is the cost. High reward and low cost equals repeat. You will repeat that, especially with low to zero effort. Think social media and scrolling. Think delivery. Think receiving all of this so-called pleasure without putting in effort. That hijacks how we are constructed for our rewards. It's effort first, then rewards. You don't deserve reward without effort. You will be owned, or you are owned. Low reward and high cost equals avoid, even if it is meaningful. Imagine yourself as a 12-month-old or 13-month-old, whatever the case, and you're learning to walk without realizing it, and you're taking a few steps and you're falling down every time. You get up, you take 2 or 3 more steps, and you fall down. What's reliable here is what's going to be continuous is you're falling down on your butt, but you keep getting back up. And then you learn to walk a couple more steps. Then maybe a couple more steps. Then you fall down. You get back up. Imagine yourself being 12 or 13 months old and saying, I can't do this. So you're going to avoid it. You are going to avoid walking. Imagine a 12 or 13-month-old being able to have that negative self-talk. Earlier in this series, we explored how temptation progressively trains distorted valuation, comfort, validation, and control. The valuation system itself begins recalibrating. The self increasingly values truth and alignment, meaning, integrity, and righteousness, more than comfort and image or domination. And maybe this is why this beatitude uses hunger and thirst, because now the motivational force itself has transformed. The self is no longer merely avoiding discomfort. It is actively moving toward alignment. And importantly, this is not reactive, not impulse, not compulsive. This is oriented motivation. Motivation with purpose. The self begins wanting different things. And perhaps this is one of the clearest signs of deep transformation, not merely resisting destructive impulses, but progressively losing its interest in them altogether. And this is one of the deepest forms of transformation possible. Transformation becomes real when the self no longer merely behaves differently, but values differently. The next beatitude, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Mercy emerges only after humility, emotional honesty and depth, regulation, and motivational transformation. That sequence matters because now compassion is no longer performance, ideology, moral signaling, or social compliance. It becomes genuine understanding. The self begins recognizing limitation, suffering, vulnerability, and incompleteness in others because it has confronted those realities within itself. So you can recognize it. This is psychologically profound because many forms of judgment actually function defensively. Judgment creates distance. Mercy reduces distance. These are anti-correlated. Mercy becomes possible when the self no longer requires superiority to stabilize itself. Judgment is an impulse because once someone confronts their own limitation, fragmentation, vulnerability, and incompleteness, harsh judgment often becomes psychologically harder to maintain. And perhaps this is why genuinely merciful people often feel psychologically grounded rather than performative. Their compassion emerges from integration rather than superiority. This directly counters ego inflation, certainty, and domination. And relationally, the self becomes less adversarial, less defensive, less threatened by imperfection. Mercy is not weakness. It is understanding that emerges after confronting your own humanity honestly. The next beatitude. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. This is not perfectionism or moral obsession. Purity here may be closer to internal congruence. What are you aligned with? The fragmentation of the self decreases. Competing motives weaken, and persona pressure weakens. Manipulation weakens, and performance weakens, and the self becomes increasingly clear, aligned, and internally coherent. Or perhaps more simply, the self stops dividing itself constantly. And perhaps this is why internal congruence feels psychologically relieving. The mind no longer spends enormous energy maintaining contradictions between persona and self, performance and reality, external identity and internal truth. And psychologically, this matters enormously because many people experience chronic internal conflict. One identity socially versus another privately. One value publicly versus another internally. But purity of heart reduces fragmentation. And perhaps this is why temptation itself weakens here. Because temptation often exploits divided valuation. Temptations are only after your weakness. Otherwise, they're not a temptation. It's not a test to you. But when the self becomes internally aligned, impulsivity weakens, performative identity weakens, and defensive narratives weaken. The self becomes more difficult to manipulate because it is less divided internally. And perhaps this is what true integrity actually is. Not moral perfection, but increasing congruence between what the self values, what it believes, and how it lives. Purity is not perfection. It is decreasing internal fragmentation. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Peacemaking is not passivity. It is relational alignment without domination. This directly counters the third temptation, control. The transformed self no longer requires superiority, ideological domination, and compulsive certainty or power to stabilize identity. Because internally, stable people do not need constant external victory to maintain coherence. And this is extremely important psychologically, because many people unconsciously attempt to regulate internal instability through control, argument, superiority, certainty, or aggression. But peacemaking emerges when the self no longer needs domination to remain stable. Seek the saying in the Old Testament, when God had a long nose. Understand what that means. This is not weakness. It is mature relational structure. The self can now tolerate difference, tolerate uncertainty, tolerate complexity, without collapsing into aggression or control. And perhaps this is one of the clearest signs of transformation. The self becomes capable of relationship without domination. Peacemaking is not the absence of strength. It is strength no longer organized around control. And the last beatitude, coming back full circle with the present tense. Blessed are those persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This final beatitude mirrors the first. Again, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Present tense, and perhaps this reveals the completed structure. The self began open, incomplete, receptive, and now the self becomes congruent, aligned, stable, and internally grounded enough to withstand external pressure without abandoning itself. This is not merely persecution. Psychologically, this is self-respect, self-acceptance, integrity, stable value identity. The crowd no longer fully determines the self. Systems no longer completely define identity. External pressure no longer automatically overrides internal alignment. Now the works of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Jung are coming fully on board. Their writings are all about this. The self can now tolerate rejection, misunderstanding, social pressure, and uncertainty without collapsing back into fragmentation. And perhaps this is one of the deepest forms of freedom possible. The self no longer requires external permission to remain itself. And maybe this is why the final beatitude returns to the present tense, because alignment itself becomes the kingdom, not perfection, not status, and not domination, but congruence. And perhaps this is the entire arc of transformation. The self begins with humility and openness and ends with integrity, strong enough to remain aligned despite pressure from the world. The final stage of transformation is not perfection. It is remaining aligned without abandoning yourself. Across this series, we have explored perception, prediction, systems, persona, social reality, temptation, and distortion. Who owns you? Can you fit in or not? Are you like the so-called normal people or not? But perhaps the deeper question underneath all of this has always been, can the self transform? And maybe the Beatitudes answer, yes, but not through performance and domination, optimization, or ego inflation. And perhaps this entire progression can now be understood as the gradual reorganization of the human self away from defensive fragmentation or impulsive valuation or externalized identity and crowd-dependent meaning toward congruence and alignment, emotional integration, and internal stability evaluation. Transformation begins with humility, self-awareness, emotional honesty and depth, the courage and alignment, compassion, congruence, and ultimately self-acceptance. Not passive acceptance, not resignation, but acceptance clear enough to permit transformation. Rogers may have understood something profound. The self changes most deeply, not when it is endlessly defended, but when it becomes open enough to finally see itself clearly. And perhaps that is the paradox at the center of the Beatitudes as well. Perhaps the Beatitudes are not describing passive morality at all. Perhaps they are describing what happens when the self progressively stops organizing itself around fear. The self transforms, not by defending itself constantly, but by finally becoming open enough to see itself clearly. Perhaps that is why the Beatitudes begin and end in the present tense. The kingdom is already present, first through openness, and finally through alignment. The Beatitudes may not be describing passive morality at all. They may be describing the progressive transformation of the human self. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge. I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. We can have conversations about psychology, philosophy, autism, whatever. You can email me info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. You can check out the YouTube page for full-length videos, shorts, and clips. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.